Hello.
Okay.
Is my sound coming across okay? I would say that it is. Okay? Yeah. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. It's a delight to see so many of you here. We are here at St. Matthew's Catholic Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. My name is Craig Martell. I've been the leader, instigator of this series. I'm joined tonight by Farrell O'Gorman, who is handing out some documents to all of the tables. Farrell, I'll do a formal introduction of Farrell when I turn the mic over to him in just a bit. So can we put up the first screen? So, as we have the previous couple nights, let us start with a prayer. This is a prayer from Flannery O'Connor's prayer journal. I can lead the prayer. Dear God, contrition is largely imperfect. I don't know if I've ever been sorry for a sin because it hurt you. That kind of contrition is better than none, but it is selfish. To have the other kind, it is necessary to have knowledge, faith extraordinary. All boils down to grace, I suppose. Again, asking God to help us be sorry for having hurt him. I'm afraid of pain, and I suppose that is what we have to get grace. Give me the courage to stand the pain to get the grace, O Lord. Help me with this life that seems so treacherous, so disappointing. Name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So this is an undated entry from her prayer journal. Next slide, please. Just a quick look at the agenda for tonight. We'll do a quick look back at last week, our session with Jerome Foss, who joined us over Zoom. It'll take a few minutes. Then I will do the introduction of our guest presenter tonight, Farrell, who's going to lead us through a discussion of Parker's back. We've set aside about an hour, so we'll have plenty of room, I think, for Farrell to take us through that and to accommodate questions and answers. Then I will get off the stage, turn the mic over to Farrell, and then I'll come on near the end to take a look at what's planned for next week. The short story for next week is the Temple of the Holy Ghost, the reading assignments that people have been accustomed to getting, and then after the closing prayer, I'd like to turn on the music. Last week I mentioned one of my friends, a fellow, Flannery O'Connor fellow at the Summer Institute by the name of Colin Cutler. We've handed out some lyrics for a song that we're going to play as we kind of wind down for the night. Farrell is a musician Colin is a musician whose songs have been inspired by Flannery O'Connor's short stories. Next slide, please. So we started our first session with Father Dennis giving us one of his infamous charts. Mystery was kind of the theme for that first night. Next slide, please. So I've taken the liberty of looking at our presenter last week. There was some discussion, some questions, and some experience with grace in that Good Country People short story. Jerome's title was Intellectuals, Grace, and Philosophy. He discussed a short story, some letters from Alfred Korn, and one of the essays, an introduction to the memoir of Mary Ann. And to follow up on that discussion over the last week, I've shared some collateral with you all. The recording itself, which will eventually be posted on the parish YouTube site, a transcript that I did from the Zoom capabilities. That's a 15-page transcript. It's quite lengthy, but I recommend taking a look at it. If you care not to, I put together what I consider my top takeaways from that discussion, and I asked Jerome to take a look at it, and he agreed that that's a pretty good synthesis. I distributed a document, The Contemplative Mentality in Good Country People, which was written by Jerome. And I also distributed another paper called The Echoing Afterlife of Cliches in Flannery O'Connor's Good Country People. It's an article that I ran across when I was at the Institute in June of 2023. I think it does a really good job of summarizing what Jerome talked about, in particular kind of the two parts of that story, the front end where you have the three ladies talking, and then the appearance of Manly Power, the Bible salesman. Next slide, please. So just some quick takeaways. In the letter to Alfred Korn, don't write off faith too quickly, she advised. Faith ebbs and flows. Belief is, and she quotes, I can't recall who it is now, but Gerard Manley Hopkins is nurtured by giving alms. Nourish what she calls Christian skepticism. In the introduction to the memoir of Mary Ann, intellectuals have this misconception that the presence of suffering in the world is evident that there's not really a loving God. In the story itself, just a couple of key lines. I've been believing in nothing my whole life. Manly Pointer in the hayloft scene. And then Jerome called out this particular line, the description of Mrs. Hopewell. Mrs. Hopewell. She has no bad qualities of her own, but she was able to use other people's in such a constructive way that she never felt the lack. And then there was some commentary that Jerome shared with us about Flannery O'Connor, the writer, her vision, how that plays out in her stories. So I captured this quote: a good writer, if they're good at their craft, just tells the story, and the vision that's there takes care of the rest. Next slide. We've seen this a number of times. This is a pictorial inventory of her canon. She wrote two novels and one collection of short stories. The blue line represents her death. So her one collection of short stories and her complete stories were published after her death, as were her essays, a collection of her letters, collection of reviews she did for the Georgia Bulletin, her cartoons, and then the prayer journal, which we quoted before. Next slide. So here we are in the third week, May 12th, okay? First session, we did the Uncommon Grace documentary. There is a recording of that first session, as there is for the second one, where we discussed Good Country People last week. Tonight, Parker's back, and then I'll come back to the next sessions later on in the session. Next slide. So I think I completed all my assignments for last week. Our discussion tonight, we'll see how good the participants did in reading the story, looking at some of the optional but recommended essay, the one recommended essay, and then O'Connor's letter to Louise Abbott that Farrell suggested we take a look at. Can you admit that one? There's someone at the top needs to be admitted into the Zoom room. Thank you. And next slide, please. Okay, so I want to introduce Farrell now. So Farrell is a professor of English at Belmont Abbey, where he's taught courses on American and modern literature since 2012. Previously, he taught at Mississippi State University and Catholic Studies at DePaul. He's got a couple of scholarly books, Peculiar Crossroads, which has given the name to the series. His book is out there on the table if you want to take a peek at it. Second one, Catholicism and American Borders in the Gothic Literary Imagination, University of Notre Dame, 2017. Twice he's been an instructor and a lecturer at the NEH Summer Institute, and that is where Farrell and I met in the second one in 2023, and he's been kind enough to introduce me to a couple of events at Belmont Abbey, which I deeply appreciate, and he was very quick to sign up to be a co-host of this session, and he's a co-trustee of the Mary Flannery O'Connor Charitable Trust. Next slide. And Farrell, you had some handouts in this, so I want to turn the mic over to you right now, okay? Thank you, Farrell, for being with us.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I'm not used to this kind of mic, so I'm worried I'll speak a little too loudly, but I'll try and control myself. So I distributed some handouts. I hope everybody's gotten one now. I think Patty has a few extra. And this is nothing magic. This is just the kind of thing where if I had a blackboard or a whiteboard, I would have written these topics on the board as things that we will discuss. But it might be handy for you to hold on to as a kind of reference point as we go along. I'm going to start first by thanking Craig for all the work that he's done in putting this series together, to St. Matthew's for hosting it. I'm really excited to see this happening here in Charlotte and to see a parish that's so interested in it. And kind of related to that, I'll tell you a little bit more about my background. This will lead us ultimately into the story. So I grew up as a Catholic in South Carolina, in rural South Carolina, until about eighth grade. And my father's family has been Catholic in South Carolina since about 1860, which I think is pretty unusual and is one of the things that links me to O'Connor. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But it's worth knowing, too, that my mother's family, my mother grew up in rural South Carolina, and my mother grew up Protestant. She converted when she married my dad, but on my mom's side, I'm related to Lutherans, Baptists, Methodists. My mother's father was a dairy farmer. I spent a lot of time on the dairy farm, and between the time on the dairy farm and my cousins who hunt on my mother's side, that kind of thing, I learned a lot of things that have helped me to understand and appreciate O'Connor's settings. But again, my father's side is Catholic in South Carolina going back to about 1860. And this will lead me into talking a little bit about Belmont Abbey and the ways in which Belmont Abbey actually has some connections to Flannery O'Connor. So my father went to Belmont Abbey back in the 1950s, right after it became a four-year college for the first time. It had been around for a while, but became a four-year college in the 1950s. My dad's favorite instructor was one of the Benedictine monks, Father John Otgen, who was from Savannah, Georgia. And Father John taught English at Belmont Abbey for many years. He was actually the president of Belmont Abbey from 1960 to 1964, but he grew up in Savannah, which was where O'Connor was born and lived until she was about 12 years old. And O'Connor, when she was in 6th, 7th grade, she went to one Catholic school up until that point, St. Vincent's Academy, but then she transferred for her last year in Savannah to Sacred Heart Catholic School, which was a co-ed Catholic elementary school, and Father John was there at the same time. So Father John remembered Flannery O'Connor actually showing up for classes, and there was another young man there named Oscar Burnett, who also became a Benedictine monk at Belmont Abbey and later was the Abbot Oscar Burnett. Sacred Heart, the parish there at that time was staffed by Benedictines. There's also a Benedictine high school in the Savannah area that has long-standing connections to Belmont Abbey. That's where O'Connor's father went to school, Edward O'Connor. I found out just within the last 2 years that O'Connor had two uncles who attended Belmont Abbey, at least briefly, in the late 1890s. So there's still some history to be put together regarding her connection to this area. And of course, Savannah and Belmont seem like such a long way apart even today, but there were so few Catholics in the area at the time that these connections, I think, were intense in the Carolinas and Georgia in all kinds of interesting ways. So I'm not going to say any more about this tonight, but I do think it's worth knowing that there is, as we live at this moment where the Catholic Church is just booming in the Carolinas and in Georgia, knowing that there is this deep history that connects America's best-known Catholic fiction writer to, obviously, not only to the state of Georgia, but even to this area. I think it's worth knowing. Last thing, the Sisters of Mercy also are based in Belmont, near Belmont Abbey, and O'Connor's mother wrote to a Sister of Mercy in the late 1950s and 1960s when O'Connor was alive, and this particular Sister of Mercy encouraged them to come visit Belmont. Unfortunately, I don't have any evidence that they ever did, but that connection was there as well. Okay, so my goal for the next 40 minutes or so is to lead a kind of interactive discussion of O'Connor's story, Parker's Back. And then, I hope there'll be a little bit of Q&A and some interaction as we go along. That's my goal. I'm going to try and teach this essentially in the way that I teach it at Belmont Abbey. But then we'll have time for more Q&A at the end. I think I'm going to begin before saying a little bit more specifically about Parker's Back by noting one statement from O'Connor about short stories, generally. A story really isn't any good unless it successfully resists paraphrase, unless it hangs on and expands in the mind. Right? So O'Connor is very interested in mystery, and stories have to make contact with mystery. A story really isn't any good unless it successfully resists paraphrase, unless it hangs on and expands in the mind. So, I think we could summarize Parker's Back as, a story about a man who gets a tattoo on his back and his wife doesn't like it. There are other ways we could summarize the story. None of them will be satisfactory. And after our interaction here for the next 45 minutes or so, I don't expect you to feel like you have all the answers to this story. I want you to feel like you have new questions and you leave with more to think about so that the story will hang on and expand in the mind for you as O'Connor would want it to. So why Parker's Back? This is not necessarily one of O'Connor's best known stories, but for me, it's probably my personal favorite of her stories. And I often tell people if I was only going to teach 2 stories by O'Connor, it would be A Good Man is Hard to Find, one of her very first best-known stories, and then Parker's Back, which was written very near the end of her life. In fact, she was working on drafts of this story on her deathbed. It wasn't actually published until after she died. So it's very late in her career, and I think the 2 stories that sort of bookend her career in interesting ways. But Good Country People, which you talked about last week, is a story from early in her career, one of her great early stories, and Parker's Back is one of her great last stories. I've got, when I teach just one story by O'Connor in a literature class at Belmont Abbey, I teach some classes where I teach more than one story. I like to teach lots of things by her, but if I'm going to just teach one story, this has come to be the one that I teach because I think it engages students in lots of different ways. Again, I've given you some topics that we're going to touch on, but I'd like to, say some things, ask some questions, have some back and forth here. And I think with Parker's Back, this is, any story, this story has 2 main characters, obviously, Parker and Sarah Ruth. And this question doesn't work with every story. It's pretty simple, but I find it usually works fairly well with Parker's Back. We've got Parker and we've got Sarah Ruth. Which one do you like better and why? Just as an opening question. And I often have the response, well, I don't really like either of them, which I think is a fair first reaction. But if you had to choose, right, Parker or Sarah Ruth, which one do you like better and why? Anybody feel like volunteering? Yeah. Parker.
Yep.
Yeah.
Greater depth. He's certainly had the ebb and flow, seemingly from good to bad, but he was searching. He was trying. There's a lot of symbolism in him. Interesting character.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's depth, there's motion, right? He's a man on a search, right? I think those are essential facts to recognize about Parker. Yeah. Other people. Yeah. Jeremy.
I think Parker's more dynamic. He's got an arc. I think that Parker is more dynamic. He's different at the end than he was from the beginning, I think.
I think Parker is more dynamic. He changes over the course of the story, whereas I felt like Sarah Ruth was pretty much consistent. And so I found that more interesting to follow him.
Yeah. Yeah. If we're thinking in, kind of standard literary terms, Parker is a dynamic character who changes. Sarah Ruth is a flat character who is pretty consistent throughout the story. And sometimes I have people who prefer Sarah Ruth for that reason. I find in general that people prefer Parker, and I think that on the whole, O'Connor prefers Parker. But the more I've taught the story, I've gone through stages where I used to just talk about everything that was good about Parker and everything that was bad about Sarah Ruth, and there's a lot to talk about there. But I do actually think that they're obviously both vital to the action of the story, and I think that O'Connor thinks that they both offer things of value, even though they're both flawed characters as well. Does anybody want to speak up on behalf of Sarah Ruth? Say anything? Yeah.
One thing I think about Sarah Ruth, now that I think about it, is how she how do I want to say this? We get into Parker's dilemma about, he marries this woman, though he didn't really, want to be with her, that sort of thing. And obviously, Sarah Ruth, it seems like on the face of it, she wouldn't want to be with Parker. But she is. And so I think, but we don't really get much view into that thinking on her side.
About why she wants to be
about why she wants to marry him
Yeah.
and be with him. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if there's an answer, Parker thinks he knows what it is, but it's a fair question, yeah.
I would say that, of the two, my first instinct was to say I didn't like either of them, like, as you mentioned, but I think that to say something positive about her would be the fact, maybe the way she's, she talked about how the tattoos were just, they were bad and all this stuff. Maybe the way she was convicted him, and that's why he was on that search and trying to please her and trying to maybe find the good.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. So we're obviously, we're going to keep talking about these two characters as we go along. And touching on our first topic here, this may end up being, in part, just a continuation of what we've already begun to discuss. So eros and agape are Greek words for love. Yeah, Greek words for love. And many of you may have heard this in homilies. You may have read a book by C.S. Lewis called The Four Loves. Many of my students, that's sort of their first introduction to thinking about different Greek words for our English word love. My touch point for thinking about these two is Pope Benedict's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, where he pretty concisely addresses eros and agape. And so, while it sounds like many of you are familiar with the terms generally, I think it's worth reviewing what Pope Benedict has to say, because I really think that this sheds a lot, I think it's really relevant to the story. So eros, for Pope Benedict, is a he clarifies, is a self-seeking love, right? The self perceives itself as somehow empty, as somehow hungry, and I must grasp at something which will fulfill the self, right? This is the essence of eros. And he even talks about it as ascending love, so trying to grab at something that seems just out of reach, thinking about that motion. That's eros. Agape is a self-giving love, right? Agape is a self-giving love, and agape is, again, can be thought about with relation to motion. So Pope Benedict calls it a descending love, right? The person who is demonstrating agape is somebody who is reaching out from a position maybe of relative security or comfort to help somebody who's in need of help, right? This is agape, this is charity, charitable love, and he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example. And of course, agape is often seen as the most fundamentally Christian form of love. Benedict talks about the fact that, of course, eros can be corrupted, but eros is actually part of our nature, part of our being as well. Here's a question. Which one has to do with the body and which one has to do with the soul? According to Benedict, or just generally? Anybody? It's kind of a trick question because Benedict says they each have to do with each. We are composite. We are creatures who are body and soul. And properly understood, right, eros has to do with body and soul, and so does agape. So for agape, simply feeling charitable towards somebody isn't actually enough. One has to actually do something. There has to be a physical aspect to agape. And even thinking about the Eucharist, right, in relation to agape is, of course, God self-giving, right? In the Eucharist, there's a physical form to it. Okay, so these are theological terms, but I think they can help us to understand the story in various ways. Which character in this story most clearly demonstrates eros, this sense of hunger, this sense of restlessness, this sense that I need to grab something that is going to fill me? Which character? Parker. Very, very clearly, and this is demonstrated, of course, through the tattoos, right? It's demonstrated in other ways, too. Parker is driven by hungers in lots of different ways, but his hunger to always acquire another tattoo, right, is clearly an example of this. Which character most clearly demonstrates agape in the story? It's a trickier question, maybe. I think it's Parker, too. Now you can argue maybe Sarah Ruth is trying to give some things, but in what way does the story turn on Parker giving that last tattoo? And of course, he's giving his body, he's giving his flesh, right? He misjudges badly. He should know that his wife, right, given his history with her, he should realize that she may be very skeptical about this tattoo, which she turns out to be. But if you actually read the story, right, Parker is trying to please her. He is actually trying to give her a gift, and he is giving his body, right, as he does it. And she ends up rejecting this gift. But I think understanding Parker as fully embodying eros and agape is really important to understanding the story. And of course, right, the back, I am not, I'll go ahead and say I have no tattoos, not yet. I have some family members who advocate for family tattoos, and some say never. I have no experience with tattoos, but obviously we live in a world where more and more people are interested in these, and it is interesting. I taught this story to high school students just a few weeks ago. I've taught it to college students off and on for 15 to 20 years, and one thing we talk about is, of course, in the story, this story is written in the early 1960s. Who gets tattoos then? The sailors, people in prison, people in bike gangs. So, right, just having a tattoo would be a sign that you're sort of on the fringes of society. You're a sinner. Right, probably is a way to think about it at the time. These days, tattoos have a completely different, I think, completely different place in our culture. But the point is, even knowing as little about tattoos as I do, I recognize that the back is the best canvas, right? If you're going to get one really big special tattoo, that's the best canvas for it. And Parker has devoted his entire life to trying to get these tattoos that he thinks will satisfy him somehow. And of course, it hasn't been working. They satisfy for a little bit and then they wear off. But finally, he thinks, I've got one last big spot left. Does he get something that he really thinks he wants for himself? No. He gets something that he thinks will please his wife. So I see his giving of his back for this tattoo as a gift. Right below this, I've got a question. Where can God be found, right? So where can God be found in the story? I think that's a broad question that we probably can't fully answer in the time that we have. It's one that's meant to hang on and expand in the mind. But I think a relatively simple question, but yet also kind of hard to answer, is for Sarah Ruth, where can God be found? Because Sarah Ruth obviously thinks of herself as a profoundly Christian woman. She thinks about God a great deal. For Sarah Ruth, where can God be found? It's a simple question, but... Yeah. She says, God is a spirit, no man shall see his face. So she says that, but it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't answer the question, I think, as fully as we would like. Where else might she say God can be found?
In the Bible, because,
Yeah.
you know, she just, like he had said something about a tattoo with the verse on it, and she said, what do I need a tattoo for? I've got the whole Bible.
She's got the Bible, yeah. I think she definitely said God could be found in the Bible, and even more so, I think, probably in my head while I'm reading the Bible, right? I think Sarah Ruth is inclined to think in this way. Her father is a straight gospel, capital S, capital G preacher, and that is not an actual real Protestant denomination that I'm aware of, but it ties her to a kind of what's sometimes called low church Protestantism, right, where the emphasis is on the text, reading the text of the book, and there's not any liturgy, and there's not any religious art of any kind, and there's not an emphasis on the sacraments, right? So that is the Christianity that Sarah Ruth is familiar with. She's used to being in... we actually never get a picture of her in a church, but she's used to being in a church where, of course, there's no altar. If there's anything, there's a pulpit, and there's the preacher up there reading the text, and there's no sacraments. So let me say just a bit more about that. How does anybody want to try and characterize Sarah Ruth's Christianity? I mean, other than I just use the term low church, I use the term straight gospel. What are some other... let me ask this. Let me point out a couple of things, and then I'll come back to my question. I think that Sarah Ruth is, in terms of the question, where can God be found? Right under that, I've got the topics nature, art, and God. What does Sarah Ruth think of art generally? Idolatrous. So certainly the tattoos are idolatrous. Where do she and Parker get married? In like a county courthouse, because even churches are idolatrous, right? She worries that a church building can become a kind of idol. Notice she also doesn't wear any makeup. You know, simple enough. She was plain. That's one of the things that we're told about her. So she doesn't like art of all kinds, in the simple sense of makeup, any kind of tattoos, but she doesn't even like religious art, right? Even though she says she's a devout Christian. So I think Sarah Ruth exemplifies a kind of Christianity that stresses a competition between God and art, God and nature. It's God versus nature, God versus art. Everything in the world, whether it's natural or artificial, is a potential distraction from God. That's the way that Sarah Ruth tends to think. And when I say nature, I would include the human body, right, as part of nature. What's Sarah Ruth's view of the human body? I think she's kind of dismissive of it. Notice that she's relatively thin. She doesn't eat much. She eats apples when Parker brings them early in the story, which is interesting. But whereas Parker is kind of heavy, he likes food, and Parker likes to chase women before he meets Sarah Ruth and marries her. Sarah Ruth seems uninterested in food, She's uninterested in relations with her husband even after they're married for the most part, except with the lights out. So Sarah Ruth is very suspicious of the body, nature, and of artificial things. And I think she tends to see it's either God or those other things. So maybe Sarah Ruth exemplifies you could argue, a stereotypical kind of Southern Protestant, right? That seems to make a certain amount of sense here. But if we're thinking elsewhere in terms of American history, and I'm thinking as somebody who teaches literature, I can start talking about authors in relation to this. But if we're thinking in American history of famous American Christians who were worried about art becoming idolatrous and did not like images, there's a pretty famous group early in American history, and they weren't Southerners. The Puritans. The Puritans, exactly, right? So the New England Puritans, who Nathaniel Hawthorne writes about, this is how I most often think about the Puritans, but they are a certain radical Protestant group who originates in England, and of course their history with regard to the Anglican Church is complicated, but one thing that is true is that they reject all sorts of religious art. So when the Puritans actually come to power in England in the 1600s, they smash statues, they smash stained glass windows, they whitewash the insides of churches because they are worried that all the religious art is idolatrous. And Sarah Ruth, one takeaway from this story is that Sarah Ruth exemplifies a kind of Christian vision that could be associated with somebody like the Puritans, and that I think has a particularly strong history in American culture, right? And it's not just the South. I mean, obviously she is a Southerner, but it's not just the South. So this kind of history in American Christianity of being suspicious of art is one thing that we see in Sarah Ruth. And O'Connor did say that Nathaniel Hawthorne was actually the American writer with whom she felt the greatest kinship. Right? And I think that if you read Hawthorne and you understand him deeply, he's actually critiquing some of these characteristics of the Puritans that I've just been highlighting. I mean, related to that, I've written the term iconoclasm there. What is iconoclasm? It's the destruction of art, religious art, because it's believed to be idolatrous. And just to kind of stand back and contextualize a little bit more, if we think about monotheism generally, so I've been talking about Christianity in particular, right? But the three monotheisms, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, which is most friendly to religious art that depicts the human figure? Is it Judaism? Is it Islam? Or is it Christianity? It's Christianity. Yeah. Islam and traditional Judaism, right, are very concerned with the possibility of idols. Of course, in Islam, you cannot to have an image of Allah or Muhammad, right? This would be absolutely forbidden. So in a strange way, right, Sarah Ruth is exemplifying this kind of fear of idols that you could see in other monotheisms. And within Christianity, right, we've got the three major branches: Protestantism, Catholicism, and the Orthodox churches. And there are a range of Protestants, but Sarah Ruth exemplifies, this fairly radical branch that the Puritans are examples of. And yeah, if you look, obviously, Catholicism and the Orthodox churches are much more friendly to religious art. And Parker actually gets a Byzantine icon, right? It is a Byzantine icon that is tattooed on his back. So I think that's all very significant. The whole, the history of Western art, but up until the modern era, is largely religious art. Madonna and Child, images of the crucifixion, the Sistine Chapel, right? So because of the Incarnation, religious art that depicts the human figure, Christ, the prophets, the saints, is okay. It's okay to venerate these saints and God himself through the images. So the Catechism actually talks about that briefly, and the fact that it is the Incarnation, right, that makes that acceptable in a way that you don't see in the other monotheisms. And all of this, I think, O'Connor knows and is interested in the story. She is interested in a God who is incarnational, a God who is sacramental, and I think that Parker is stumbling his way towards some kind of experience of that God without knowing it. Parker couldn't explain all of this to you, but I think Parker is sort of stumbling in that direction. So I'll go ahead and say that I think for Sarah Ruth, it's nature and art versus God. I think that for Parker, it's nature, including the body, and then art, and then maybe at the end he's moving closer to God. I think it's debatable what's happening at the end, but instead of these things being in opposition to one another, there's a continuum, right? Properly understood, they're related to one another, and you don't have to reject one in order to move towards the other. And we see that really clearly, of course, in him actually being interested in pleasures of the flesh, of the body, but realizing that's not enough. I need art. And then he begins to get the art on his body. But we see that over time, no matter what artificial things he gets, they satisfy him for a while, but the heart is always restless until it rests in God. And I would say that because of Sarah Ruth, he is actually moving closer to God at the end of the story without really knowing it. But yeah, we had that image of Parker experiencing a continuum between nature, art, and God, whereas for Sarah Ruth, it's either or. Let's look at one of the most important passages from the story on page 657. So this will highlight some of the things I've been talking about, I hope, but maybe lead us to some other things as well. Before I read this is the bottom of 657, let me just ask, I've written the term epiphany or epiphanies right in the middle of the page. We know that, of course, in the church calendar, the Feast of the Epiphany commemorates the Magi, and the birth of the Christ child. But in literature, what's an epiphany? An aha moment, a kind of realization, a recognition of something that's always been true, but it's kind of been behind a veil, and the veil is removed, and now you see it, right? That's the way to think about it. And generally, James Joyce, the Irish somewhat Catholic writer, is given credit for taking this term and making it a literary term, not a church history or ecclesial term. But yeah, I wanted to mention this before we look at this passage, because let me ask before we look at this passage, where is the epiphany in this story? It's another kind of trick question, I think, right? Where is the epiphany in this story? I think there are multiple.
I agree. Ongoing. There are many.
Yeah. They unfold, right? In some of O'Connor's stories, if there's an epiphany, it comes really quickly. So I think A Good Man Is Hard to Find is, which you haven't read yet, is sort of a prime example of that, where there's something like a deathbed conversion, but it kind of comes once and it comes quickly. And as you read the O'Connor stories, you can ask where, if anywhere, are the epiphanies? In Good Country People, I think people read it, and at the end of the story, arguably, we have a sort of epiphany about Holga. We understand her better than we did before, but does she really understand herself? Has she really seen the light, received grace? What's going to be next for her? I think those are relatively fair questions for that story. One of the things I like about this story is the fact that there's not just one epiphany. I think it is ongoing, right? I think Parker's life, even though this story, his getting the tattoo, it's only taking place over a short period of time. We have flashbacks where we see much earlier in his life, and I think O'Connor is suggesting that maybe life is a series of epiphanies, and it seems to me this is a more Catholic way, maybe, to see reality than, yeah.
She had a short life, so maybe she didn't have the opportunity. You were saying that she kind of leaves these things open-ended at the end. What do you think about it? Was Parker moving towards God? Anything that she ever put out that really showed what she actually was thinking, what was her intent in it, or was it left open-ended because all of these are optional for the reader?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I think she would say she doesn't want to force the reader. She wants the reader to be actively engaged. She doesn't want to make the epiphany too overwhelming. Does that help to answer your question? But yeah, I don't think she would say that it was a function of the shortness of her life.
I'm
Yeah.
saying she didn't, I'm not aware that she came out afterwards and said, yes, I wrote this because at the end of it, yes, Parker's life was improving, he was moving towards God.
Right.
That it-
Right.
It's just,
Right.
it's always open-ended, and that's the way it was meant to be.
Yeah. Right. Well, in this story, right, she died right shortly after she completed it, so we don't know what she might have said. But she did say about some other stories, like A Good Man Is Hard to Find. She sort of explains what happens at the end and how she sees the epiphany happening there. Although she also says that she recognizes some people will read it other ways, but she wants to explain what she saw. But this is a good question to keep coming back to, I think, as you read different stories.
Let me just suggest that we pause, if we do have a question, get the mic so that we can capture the question on the audio.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good. So yeah, let's look on page 657. So this is very early in the story. Parker's 28 when the action of the story's taken place, but we have this flashback to when he was 14, right? So halfway through his life. Parker was 14 when he saw a man in a fair, tattooed from head to foot. Except for his loins, which were girded with a panther hide, the man's skin was patterned in what seemed from Parker's distance, he was near the back of the tent standing on a bench, a single intricate design of brilliant color. The man, who was small and sturdy, moved about on the platform, flexing his muscles so that the arabesque of men and beasts and flowers on his skin appeared to have a subtle motion of its own. Parker was filled with emotion, lifted up as some people are when the flag passes. He was a boy whose mouth habitually hung open. He was heavy and earnest, as ordinary as a loaf of bread. When the show was over, he had remained standing in the tent, or standing on the bench, staring where the tattooed man had been until the tent was almost empty. Parker had never before felt the least motion of wonder in himself. Until he saw the man at the fair, it did not enter his head that there was anything out of the ordinary about the fact that he existed. Even then, it did not enter his head, but a peculiar unease settled in him. It was as if a blind boy had been turned so gently in a different direction that he did not know his destination had been changed. He had his first tattoo sometime after the eagle perched on the cannon. It was done by a local artist. It hurt very little, just enough to make it appear to Parker to be worth doing. This was peculiar too, for before he had thought that only what did not hurt was worth doing. Right, there's so much in that paragraph and a half or 2.5 paragraphs that I just read. And clearly, right in the middle of it, we're told this is a turning point for Parker, a moment where art, and in this case it's art on this man's body, somehow stirs him to wonder, right? We get the impression that there's a part of Parker that could be content simply eating food and, again, sort of chasing women aimlessly, but there's a part of him that will not be satisfied. He's hungry, right? There's the eros. He's grasping at things that he thinks will fill him up. But he realizes at this moment there is a part of him that will not be satisfied with the things that might make an animal happy. There is a part of him that needs something more, and it's art. And so this is when he begins to acquire the tattoos. And it's very early in his life, but it sets him out on this journey that leads him eventually to Sarah Ruth, and then to what we get at the end of the story. Yeah. So, other moments that seem like they might be epiphanies, it seems to me there are at least two Does anybody, I'll repeat them if somebody says something, but yeah. It seems to me there are at least two moments that sort of stand out as epiphanies. Yeah, Patty?
I think the burning bush is
Yeah.
pretty significant.
Yeah, exactly. When he crashes the tractor into the tree and it's a burning bush moment, and his shoes are actually knocked off, right? And Moses has to take off his shoes to approach the burning bush. So that's very deliberate. That's right. Any other moments of seeming epiphany? Yeah.
I think even earlier in the story, just about the passage that you read, when he touches hands with Sarah Ruth for the first time, he was jolted back to life by her touch. And he said, I don't want nothing to do with this one.
Yeah.
That there was
When he first
an
touches,
awakening and attention.
when he and Sarah Ruth first touch one another. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a whole series of them. And the last lines of the story, right after Parker has been beaten by Sarah Ruth, he's leaning against a tree crying like a baby, right? And so that image, leaning against a tree, in O'Connor's work, in more than one case, right, the tree is associated with the cross, and he's crying like a baby. So is he being crucified? He's just suffered through something like the Passion, right, where she's been beating his back and welts form on the face of the tattooed Christ. So it seems like he's been participating in something like the Passion, but then he's crying like a baby. So is he being reborn, right? We end the story with that question. So there are these cascading sorts of epiphanies. Yeah.
The tattoo itself, he put everything that he believed would make him happy on his front.
Yeah.
Kept the back clean.
Yeah.
And then had this epiphany where something different, something he couldn't see, something done for somebody else, he put onto his back, which he would never be able to see unless he got in those double mirrors.
Right.
And it was different, and it was better. And then he was judged for it. And then, as you just said, the passion element in the end of it
Yeah.
was clearly scourged against the tree, crying.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in the moment where he's getting the tattoo and he sees the tattoo in the book, the eyes seem to look at him, right, and call him back to that page. So it's the eyes of the Byzantine icon. And I guess one thing that's implied in the story, of course, is that not all images of God, of Christ, are equal. So some of the images he's seeing in the tattoo book, even though they're supposedly of Jesus, they're not as compelling as this Byzantine icon, which really grabs him. So that's a kind of moment of epiphany there. Let me just ask about one more thing that I think will tie up some elements of the story, hopefully, and lead us into some more kind of open-ended Q&A for 10 or 15 minutes. The topic that I've written on I've written various topics for sacraments. Remember, of course, that Parker was just described as looking as ordinary as a loaf of bread when he first sees the tattooed man. And then at the end of the story, arguably, he is somehow participating in, representing the body of Christ. So there's a Eucharistic element there. Obviously, this story is about a marriage. This is not about a marriage any of us would hold up as an ideal, but it is about marriage, and Parker is actually trying to give himself, I think, to his wife at the end. So you could think about the sacraments, but let's just talk about biblical allusions for a second, specifically about prophets, right? So Moses is referred to via the burning bush, right, allusion. What other prophets are mentioned or arguably alluded to in the story? His name, yeah. Obadiah, right, is a minor prophet who I never think about except with regard to this story, but Obadiah is a minor prophet, and then Elihu is a biblical reference as well. So we've got that, we've got Moses. What other prophets are relevant, directly referred to, perhaps? There's one who's named, briefly.
Not necessarily a prophet, but you got Sarah, the wife of Abraham.
Yeah, I think Sarah Ruth's name is significant, and we should say more about that in a second. But Jonah is referenced when he is thrown out of the bar right? He's briefly compared to Jonah there for a second, which I don't know if that implies that going back to Sarah Ruth is like going to Nineveh, but Jonah is specifically referenced there. Arguably, at the beginning, right before he meets Sarah Ruth and touches her, his truck breaks down, and O'Connor doesn't like cars generally. Cars are usually, having your car break down is probably a sign that spiritually you're on the road to something good happening. Arguably, there's a Saul-Paul road to Damascus thing going on there. But for the most part, it's Old Testament prophets. So Obadiah, Elihu, Moses, Jonah. And yeah, I think you could read the story in such a way, if a prophet is somebody who speaks for God, one way to understand Christ, of course, is the ultimate prophet, right? This is God actually coming into the world and speaking most fully, being directly present to us. So if Parker is somehow Christ-like at the end while he's being beaten, there's this whole line of allusions to prophets, and then he's somewhat parallel to the ultimate prophet, Christ. Yeah. You were what? You were not thinking that he...
No,
Yeah.
I was thinking that him crying and everything
Yeah.
meant that he was a child of God. Despite all his trying to be something more other than what he was, he's still a child of God.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think he can be both. He can be a child of God and a prophet. And last thing I'll say about this before we move to some more general Q&A, a prophet is fundamentally, right, somebody who, again, speaks for God. And in the Old Testament, how are the prophets received by Israel, generally? Not well. Sarah Ruth's name connects her to the Old Testament, and even her suspicion of idols, right, of graven images, might make her seem like an Old Testament figure. I think in many ways Sarah Ruth is kind of an Old Testament figure, and Parker is a very minor prophet who is meant to show his wife that that God is somehow present in the world, right? I think that Parker understands that. Parker's not an intellectual. Things don't enter his head, right? He's very different from Holga, right, in Good Country People. But I think Parker understands, right, that somehow God is present in the world, in the beauty of the world, and Sarah Ruth just doesn't see that at all. And so I think he's meant to bring this message to her, but she doesn't receive it well, and she punishes them just like, right, Israel receives the prophets harshly. Yeah.
The story ended rather I thought the story ended rather abruptly. I would have liked to have known after the scene with the tree and the burning and everything what happened to their marriage.
Yeah, I think that's a fair reaction. And again, given that O'Connor was working on it at the end of her life, that's an even more compelling question. But many of her stories do leave us, somewhat open-ended, where the story is supposed to hang on and expand in the mind. I definitely think that Parker and Sarah Ruth present two different, but ultimately, I think, maybe complementary ways of thinking about the relationship between God and the world, so the world could include art and nature. For Sarah Ruth, there's this radical division. He's a spirit, no man shall see his face. And everything material is probably evil. She's a sort of dualist. She's a sort of Manichaean, right, arguably. Sarah Ruth is. She tends to that kind of view, and this extreme asceticism where she's denying herself anything having to do with the flesh. Parker is somebody who, at the beginning, early in his life, is more interested in the flesh and really not interested in God. If he thinks there's a God, he's running away from him. And then he and Sarah Ruth kind of, run into one another. And ultimately, I think she is in ways good for him, right? If it weren't for Sarah Ruth, he wouldn't have thought about God at all, right? If he's moving closer to God throughout the story, even through his marriage, by trying to give something to her, even though they misunderstand one another, if he's moving closer to God, it's somehow because of her, and because she does think there is something outside of this world, something beyond this world. But he's the one who is exemplifying, right, a more incarnational, sacramental view where there is a God who is actually moving into the world, present in the world. And these two, right, they actually need one another. I'm inclined to like Parker more and to see him as more implicitly Catholic, although literally neither of these characters is Catholic. But I recognize, the more I've taught this story, I recognize that, yes, Sarah Ruth is actually very essential for him. So we've had some back and forth already. I mean, I could tell you that the two quotes I put on the back, I won't take the time to read them now, but I think both of these cast some light on Parker's back, just to explain what's on the back of the handout. But maybe for the next 5 or 10 minutes, we could just see if there are other questions that people want to discuss. Yeah, Jeremy.
So throughout the story, Parker's constantly commenting on trying to quit his wife. He just wants to get away. He doesn't want to come back to her. And then, O'Connor's humor seems to be in the very next line. He was back the next day. What do we make of that? I mean, what's the mystery keeping these two together then? I know they have a child, but Parker's, when he was courting her, and then again when they were married, he was constantly saying things like he didn't want to be with this woman anymore. He didn't want to stay around, and yet the next line, there he is back. What do you make of that?
Right. I think it's a very good question. I don't know that I have a brilliant answer to it. Usually in talking about the story, a question students will ask pretty early is, why are these two even together? And it seems to be an extreme example of opposites, right? Opposites attracting. But I think the story is written in such a way that we see, in rereading it, more and more, this stands out. Parker lacks something and Sarah Ruth lacks something. And even though they rub against one another, they're in conflict in all sorts of ways, I think each on some level recognizes, even Sarah Ruth, I think she recognizes Parker has something that she wants. Like, again, when he shows up with the apples and she grabs the apple and eats it. I think on some level they recognize they're incomplete. You can think about this in regard to Eros. And while maybe ultimately only God can fill the hole in their souls, they are approaching God in a very complex way through this difficult marriage that they're in.
I wondered if it was, God never lets go of us. He keeps coming back and tapping us on the shoulder and tapping us on the shoulder. I wondered if that's what she was trying to say. God was with him, even though he wasn't with God at the moment. Mm-hmm. But maybe that was God just constantly nagging at him, go back.
Go back. Yeah, that's right. And I guess kind of going along with that, even though Sarah Ruth would, I think, be, if you got her into a theological conversation, she'd be suspect, she'd be suspicious of the idea that God could sort of act through her. I think God is acting through her on Parker in the same way that he is, right, representing something she doesn't know about God to her. Yeah.
I thought of the push and pull in her address at Georgetown, in her assessment that we forget that religion costs something, and so we think of grace as feeling like an electric blanket, I think she says, but it's really the cross. And I think we know that we need faith, but it doesn't always feel like an electric blanket. So it might feel like a Sarah Ruth. You keep coming back because you know you need more.
Good.
Hope I remember what I was going to say. it seems, I mean, all these thoughts, and in particular you're listing here, the eros to agape, these two characters work off each other, and there's a movement. So in the beginning, Parker is all about eros, and he's all about him and his body and sex and whatnot. And he stops his truck, or his truck breaks down, and he sees like permanency, somebody working hard, and it's different, and he's drawn to that.
Yeah.
So she might be in the beginning, and I don't think, I mean, the story is so short, you could analyze both of them at length. But, and I don't know much about Sarah Ruth. She's major, but she's minor, so to speak.
Right. Yeah.
But Parker clearly, to me, goes from the eros to the agape at the end of it. Through her, he is being transformed. He's moving away from himself, from the eros, to trying to transform himself based on something that's important to her, God. And he misinterprets it, but he still puts that image. And you said something, too, which I think was very, very interesting, which we all read, but when the tattoo artist gave him the book, and said, hey, flip through here. You'll find like the popular ones more towards the back.
Right.
And he just couldn't find it. That was interesting because then in the beginning, it was opposite of what everybody else does. And he found that iconic Byzantine image in the beginning.
Yeah.
There's just so much stuff that's buried in there that just seems to pop out, which transforming this broken character in the beginning, still broken in the end, but I think leaning against the tree, having been scourged by her with the welts all over Jesus, his face. It's a big question. Where is she then at the end? I think for me, it's pretty clear where Parker is. Parker has ascended. Parker has grown.
Right.
Don't know where she is, but they're doing it together.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we would hope, right, that Sarah Ruth would learn some mercy. The story doesn't give us confidence that
Get the
will
broom
happen.
out of her hand.
Yeah, yeah. Is there another question, comment?
Well, one thing I thought was really interesting was how through all of his tattooing, he never reached what he thought he saw as a 14-year-old.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
having gone to county fairs in the 60s, I know those types of characters and how you can be impressed by that. But again, it's chasing after something that's really not attainable.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, I know of at least one scholarly article that's been written on this story in relation to St. Augustine, in particular. And again, I already quoted that. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Parker, Parker is moved by beauty when he's young, and he thinks it was this thing of perfect beauty, and it probably wasn't. It was something, something that caught his eye when he was young, and he thinks, I can recreate that on my own. And he just finds as he gets further into life, he can't. He's not self-sufficient, and all of his efforts to create a sort of a beauty and a beautiful life for himself, they fail somehow. So he comes to an increasing, I think, recognition of that. There's a moment late in the story, again, coming back to how he and Sarah Ruth need one another. Let's see. Yeah, I'll just read this, page 673. When he goes back to her, he tries to get into the house, and Sarah Ruth won't let him in. She says, who's there? I asked you. She wants him to say his real name. She doesn't want him just to call himself O.E., but he gives his name as a prophet, right? Parker bent down and put his mouth near the stuffed keyhole. Obadiah, he whispered. He's not like to use that name before, but here he actually uses his prophetic name. He whispered, and all at once he felt the light pouring through him, turning his spiderweb soul into a perfect arabesque of colors, a garden of trees and birds and beast. Obadiah Elihu, he whispered. So he's not been able to create this beauty on his body, but obviously, right, we have in that image there, somehow his soul is growing, it's being redeemed, there's some beauty in him, and he needed Sarah Ruth to get here, right? He wouldn't have said his actual name and had this moment if Sarah Ruth were not there. Yeah. think we're about at time. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I think we set the schedule from 7 to 8:30, but we have some spillover time. We can go till 9 as we pack up and stuff, but we're good. Can you put my PowerPoint back up? Farrell, thank you very much. And as he was talking, I remembered when we did the series in Milwaukee, we actually were able to have Alfred Korn come and speak to our group. And he wrote a paper about Parker's back. So there you have someone who encountered Flannery O'Connor, had some interaction, and he, applied it, if you will. So I'll make sure I distribute that. I don't know if you've seen that article or not, Farrell. So,
Did you ever say, Craig?
what's that?
Did you ever say what the response, like she wrote in those letters and sent in the book? Did anybody?
Yeah, I haven't gotten the answer to that question. Need to do some more research. Okay, Farrell, any comments here? I just want to put that up. This is your handout.
This is just, one of O'Connor's best-known statements from her nonfiction, from one of her essays. This actually appears in slightly different form in the essay, "The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South," which I had you read. There's just one extra sentence here at the end. So I'll just read this, right? O'Connor is saying, whenever I'm asked, and she's saying this in the late 1950s, early 60s, whenever I'm asked why Southern writers particularly have a penchant for writing about freaks, I say it is because we are still able to recognize one. To be able to recognize a freak, you have to have some conception of the whole man. And in the South, the general conception of man is still, in the main, theological. That is a large statement, and it is dangerous to make, for almost anything you say about Southern belief can be denied in the next breath with equal propriety. But approaching the subject from the standpoint of the writer, I think it is safe to say that while the South is hardly Christ-centered, it is most certainly Christ-haunted. The Southerner who isn't convinced of it is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. So again, she's saying that in the late 50s, early 60s, when the American South is very much the Bible Belt, probably even more so to a degree, right, than it is today. I think that me driving from Belmont to here on 485, I'm in a very different South than O'Connor was in when she wrote this. But yeah, I think for many of her characters, right, I think some of this is somewhat helpful for understanding Parker, but for many other characters you're going to meet as you read the O'Connor stories, understanding that the region that they live in, as O'Connor sees it, is not really Christ-centered, but it is Christ-haunted. I think that's really significant. The Southerner who isn't convinced of it is very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God. So Parker, seems to be on the run. We do have a sense that his mother, right, took him to a tent revival, and that's where he ran away to join the Navy. That's all we know about Parker's religious background, and he doesn't seem to, in this story, reflect much on his religious background. But we know his mother tried to bring him to Christ somehow, and Parker ran away, but, he's in a certain sense a Christ-haunted story, a Christ-haunted character in this story. Maybe he's very much afraid that he may have been formed in the image and likeness of God, but he's actually got an image of God that's stamped on his back at the end of the story. You'll read other O'Connor short stories where there are characters who talk a lot more about Christ, right, and reveal how they are Christ-haunted. Parker doesn't talk about it so much, but I think we see him in action, kind of exemplifying this. Yeah.
Any comments on this one, Farrell?
Well, I think this is one that, we can't talk about exhaustively today, but the whole essay, The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South, as I said, that first quote, that paragraph I just talked about, it's actually in there except for that last sentence about the image and likeness of God. I think this whole essay, which I recommended to you, is worth reading. In these essays, it's worth noting that O'Connor is addressing different audiences, right? So when she writes some aspects of the grotesque in Southern fiction, she's writing, I think, to general readers and literary critics who are trying to understand her, and she's saying, and maybe they're saying, well, she's a lot like certain other Southern writers, Erskine Caldwell, William Faulkner, maybe Truman Capote, who are writing about violence and these kind of freakish backwoods characters. Well, in some aspects of the grotesque in Southern fiction, O'Connor's writing to those sorts of readers and saying, no, you need to understand I'm really interested in theology. That's what I'm writing about. Whereas in The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South, if you read that right at the beginning of it, where's she actually giving that lecture at? At Georgetown in the 1960s, so at a Catholic university. So this essay is addressed to Catholic readers specifically, and is saying that she knows a lot of Catholic readers will think it's strange that this Catholic writer is not writing about Catholic settings or Catholic characters much. She's writing about, again, the Bible Belt. And so she's really trying to explain herself to that audience and says many things, I think, in defense of Southern Protestants who some might call, speaking very loosely, fundamentalist, who are prominent at the time that she's writing. One thing that she says, and she says this right around the time the Vatican II Council is happening. She's saying these people tend to know the Bible, and knowing the Bible is helpful for a writer, and it makes for richer characters. So she's talking in part in that essay to a Catholic world that before Vatican II, where lay people were not reading the Bible much. Lay people were stereotypically memorizing the catechism. And she says, from the point of view of a writer, she values the catechism. She thinks it's important to know dogma and so on. But for a writer, having stories, like the story of Abraham and Isaac, right, which she mentions, and having characters who act in relation to those stories, right? It's very powerful, and that's a gift that she says the South offers her in the time she's living in, that she wouldn't necessarily find if she lived in, I don't know, Boston or Chicago, something like that. I also think that the end of this paragraph is worth thinking about for various reasons. There is only one Holy Spirit, and he is no respecter of persons. I think that's a quote from Acts, I think. There is only one Holy Spirit, and he is no respecter of persons. These people, some of her wilder characters who seem very alien to Catholics, these people in the invisible church make discoveries for us who are better protected from the vicissitudes of our own natures and who are often too dead to the world to make any discoveries at all. These people in the invisible church may be grotesque, but their grotesqueness has a significance and a value. So she's writing about characters who are not members of the church, capital C, the Catholic Church, and they may seem grotesque, but she's saying that they are alive somehow, and this Holy Spirit can act through such people. There's a lot in the essay, but those sentences there stand out, and again may be helpful for understanding a number of stories that you have coming up. Although I will say that the story you have coming up next week, right, a Temple of the Holy Ghost.
Yep,
right.
That's right.
That's one of O'Connor's few stories which actually focuses on a Catholic family in the South, and I think it's a great one to follow up Parker's back with, because as you'll see when you read the story, there's a kind of emphasis on the body. I think the fundamental goodness of the body, and in that story, a really literal, right, concern with the Eucharist that makes the story pair well with Parker's back in lots of ways. Although, yeah, this essay and this paragraph that we've just been talking about are good to come back to if you're trying to understand so many of her non-Catholic but seemingly Christian characters that you'll encounter in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you, Farrell. So just to kind of wrap up here, you'll see on the slide, and you'll see when you get the PDF for the file, I've outlined in green dotted lines kind of our next two speakers. Farrell mentioned a Temple of the Holy Ghost in 2 weeks, May 26th. I think that's Tuesday after Memorial Day. Hank Edmondson will be joining us in person. He is a retired professor from Georgia College and State University. He lives in Augusta now, but he will be talking about a Temple of the Holy Ghost, and you'll see the other things he's recommended we read. His book, on the right side, A Political Companion to Flannery O'Connor, is what triggered us when we were doing the series in Milwaukee to, after we read all of her fiction, we started asking ourselves, what is she trying to teach us? In Hank's book, The Political Companion, that's where I was introduced to Farrell, actually, and a number of our other speakers, but it's in the back if you want to take a peek at it. So that's a collection of essays. His first book in 2002, The Return to Good and Evil, he wrote it all of himself, and so he will be talking about some of the topics in there in terms of the Temple of the Holy Ghost. The following week, June 2nd, we have Ralph C. Wood joining us over Zoom. Ralph is a retired professor from Baylor. He also taught at Wake Forest. I think he taught Jeremy. His book in the lower left-hand corner is called Flannery O'Connor and the Christ-Haunted South. Okay. His second book, and published in 2024, is Flannery O'Connor and the Church Made Visible. It is that book, and I was coached by Hank. I gave that book to Father Cahill when we first talked about doing this series. So these two gentlemen in the next couple of weeks are pivotal to us having teed up this series. Next slide, please. So before the next meeting, I'll distribute the PDF and the URL for the recording from tonight. I'll send out the new Zoom for the 26th. I did send out earlier today a document that I had put together after the session with Jerome. I went back and looked at some of Flannery O'Connor's comments in her letters about good country people, and that's in that document. There's also a scholar, John Sykes, who's retired from Wingate. He's a profound Flannery O'Connor scholar, and he sent along to me just a little analysis of kind of the levels of interpretation of Flannery O'Connor's stories. And so I inserted one in there for good country people, and I will share the one that he put together for Parker's Back, Farrell. So in terms of the reading assignments, read A Temple of the Holy Ghost in Collected Works, page 197 to 209, and then the essay, The Fiction Writer and His Country, pages 801 to 812, so 11 pages. And then Hank has pointed us to a specific letter that Flannery wrote to Sally and Robert Fitzgerald that is in Collected Works. He also wants us to read this other one that is not in Collected Works, so I will get a copy of that to you. And then the other thing I'd like to ask is, if you're so inclined, you've got a couple weeks, we're kind of on spring break, love to get any feedback you might have about, the series as it's played out so far, good or bad or indifferent, what could be better for you. Next slide. So just send me an email with any feedback you might have. And so, again, this is just the collection of her essays that we are trying to introduce to you as we traverse her story. So just want to put that up, and Farrell had an excerpt from some aspects of the grotesque and Southern fiction in addition to the Catholic novels in the Protestant South. Next slide. So there's actually a poster over there, an image of this tattoo that was on the back of, any image of what was on the back of Parker's back, and this will be included in your PDF. It's the front cover of a book published by Sarah Gordon, a longtime professor there in Milledgeville, and also the editor of the Flannery O'Connor Review for many years. So just an image in case you haven't seen that before. Next slide. So the ending prayer, again, excerpted from her prayer journal. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let's do this together. My dear God, to keep myself on a course, I'm going to consider faith, hope, and charity. Now faith. Of the three, this gives me the most mental pain. Dear God, please let it be that instead of that cowardice the psychologist would gloat so over and explain so glibly. And please don't let it be what they so jubilantly call watertight compartments. Dear God, please give the people like me who don't have the brains to cope with that. Please give us some kind of weapon, not to defend us from them, but to defend us from ourselves after they have got through with us. Dear God, I don't want to have invented my faith to satisfy my weakness. I don't want to have created God to my own image, as they're so fond of saying. Please give me the necessary grace, O Lord, and please don't let it be as hard to get as Kafka made it. Name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So this is, again, an undated entry from her prayer journal. So as we leave, I've passed out the lyrics to this song, A New Tattoo, Parker's Reprise. So this was written by a friend of mine whose name is Colin Cutler. He's actually going to be with us for our 12th session in the fall. So there's a copy for you of that. I need to put the music on. Can you find it? It's on here. Hear it? Is this one? This one's playing. Is this the one that's playing?
That's not playing. Here you go. New tattoo. It's the one you want, right? Yeah. You'll bring this one back up. Stop. It's like a clip. I don't know if it's cutting it off because of Zoom or what. Yeah, I don't know if the people can hear that on Zoom or not.
My name is O.E.R. What it means only God and the Navy and my know. All of my life I've been running from something. Maybe God or the Navy or my mama's good day.
Slow.
Yeah. You can put it up.
The boy with his mouth hanging down to his shoes. Now he's covered in the blood and tattoos. Did I find that child again? Keep her running. I broke my teeth on Roger Lake. Chewed every word till it made my stomach turn. tried to gain the whole world, but got underneath my skin. Put your hand out, run the speed of love. Slide and strike, time to the morning gate. New boy with his mouth hanging down to his shoes. Now he's feeling the blood and tattoo blues. Did I find that child again? Keep running.
Thanks, everyone, for staying with us. Farrell, special thank you to you for being with us. We will, God willing, we will see you in a couple weeks. Thank you. And thanks to the technology team, guys, much appreciated.